Good evening. My name is Alexander Hagan. I'm the CEO of a medium-sized tech company in Silicon Valley. Previously, I was a financial analyst and a financial journalist and worked in research in telecommunications. I want to speak to you tonight about Bolivia. I was traveling in South America this summer. My wife is from Chile. I've done extensive reading about the history in South America, its political history, the whole period of the coups that occurred during the Cold War in Brazil in 1963 with Allende in 1973, Django in Brazil, all these various things. Studied a lot of Chilean history, and I and my family went to Peru and Bolivia and Chile this summer, so this is all quite fresh on our minds, this issue of what's going on in Bolivia today. So all is quiet now on the media front. Evo has fled. His mayor, a lady named Guzman, her locks shorn, doused in red paint, humiliated, marched through the streets. Evo's house vandalized, his police protection withdrawn, his military having turned on him. His flag of the Aymara people burnt by the descendants of the colonialists, now attempting to kick out the first major indigenous leader to emerge in Latin America at this level in perhaps 200 or 300 years, perhaps since Tupac Amaru. We see videos of mestizo, that is mixed race and European descended Bolivians, that is to say the minority, burning the flag of the principal group of Bolivia, the indigenous natives, the Aymara language-speaking peoples. And Evo Morales is a pure-blood native, by and large, partially of actually Quechua origin, which are the Peruvian natives. But the Quechua go into Bolivia as well, because the borders obviously don't follow precisely the ancient languages' lines. And languages represent their peoples. The Aymara are the Bolivians, and the Quechua are the Peruvians of the high mountains. In every South American country, there is a ruling class founded in the blood of the conquistadors and their pillaging of native women. In Chile and Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia, they are used to being at the top of society and have seldom been restrained. When have these conquistadors been restrained? Well, the country I've studied is Chile, and I know of 3 events in Chile's history. You could say 4. Valdivia was a conquistador, and when a tribe rose up against him in Chile, he cut off all their toes. This is I thought there was a lovely island in Chile named Isla Moche that I was interested in, and it wasn't until much later that I horrifically found out Moche means to have your toes cut off. And from this tribe, was his personal servant, Lautaro, a Native American who learned the techniques of the Spaniards and eventually cut Valdivia's head off. That certainly was pushing back on the conquistadors. So there was the native resistances. Then there was Bernardo O'Higgins, the so-called father of Chile, who had to run away when he tried to introduce land reform to allow the people that were not at the very top of society to have some access to the resources of this vast country. He died in exile in Peru. Then there was Balmaceda, who tried to improve the conditions of working class, and it sparked a ruling class counteraction that led to his supposed suicide. He certainly died, unable to see through his reforms, but dearly beloved. And then there was Salvador Allende. All of these people, what they had in common was they tried to make life more decent for the working classes and were driven from their countries by the ruling elites. So the interesting thing about what's happening in Bolivia is that we have the complete conspiracy available to us. A leak has come out with 16 audio tapes showing exactly how this entire plot was constructed. And this certainly involved Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Jair Bolsonaro, and more to follow. And what struck me prior to hearing about these tapes, as an innocent observer, was the nastiness and the thuggishness with which the opposition carried out their operation. So, before finding out that there was a complete plan to betray Evo Morales, to install a military coup based with foreign powers, managed by political operatives in the White House along with Brazil. But there was this issue of the humiliation of this mayor, Aymara woman, the burning of their flag, the assault on the living quarters of officials. And we didn't see this same type of activity in Chile. We did see destruction of conquistador statues, but as I described to you, when the Indians in Chile, the Mapuche, got involved in these mass protests and mass strikes, they tore down, along with Chileans, the statues, because with the internet and everything, it's much harder to not know this. My wife didn't know that Valdivia had been decapitated, and she didn't know he'd cut off all the toes of the people of this tribe that Lautaro was in. They don't teach you these things in the schools, but apparently the people know, because these statues have all been destroyed in the traditional lands of the Mapuche of Chile. So now we've got three groups: the Quechua in Peru, Aymara in Bolivia, and the Mapuche in Chile, which are all linguistic groups as well as racial groups, tribal groups. So then there were some extreme acts of violence in Chile, but they seem to trace them back to right-wing people in the police and military in some cases. So these are agents provocateurs. So this guy Camacho, of European descent, didn't run and is a virulent anti-Morales person, had the Bible put in the palace or the presidential area, and he said that the Pachamama, that is the Mother Earth figure in the native religions of all three of these, the Mapuche, the Quechua, and the Aymara, he said that she will never be allowed into any government building because there's only room for the Bible and Christ. These are the kind of people we're dealing with here, totally disrespecting the native culture, hating it. These leaked audio tapes also mention Israeli support, because we know that Bolsonaro has been courting the Israelis. So it leads into Bibi's office as well, Mr. Netanyahu. That I've been able, I would have closed the roads to Brazil and Chile as soon as things started to smell funny. Now, I will say that the head of the armed forces coming out and demanding that Evo resign is the definition of a coup. And I'm extremely disappointed that Evo would have not placed Aymara people at the top levels of the military. But even such people wouldn't have been immune, because it turns out in these 16 audio tapes they threaten, they find the addresses of the military and then they blackmail them and pressure them to betray Morales. So these tapes show that there was a cabal of right-wing people, the colonial masters of the enslaved people of Bolivia, and they were making a premeditated assault to re-enslave their subjects. And this reminds me of a story in Herodotus where the Amazons go off to war, the famous warrior women of Scythia, and their men go off to war, and they end up bedding their slaves. When the men come back, they find the slaves are now with their women, and they go to battle with them, and their former slaves defeat them, and they go, "What are we doing? We forgot. We shouldn't use swords on them. They're not other fighting men. They're slaves. Use whips." And when they brought the whips out, the slaves remembered they were slaves, and they were defeated. And that is sort of the question for me about what's going to happen in Bolivia, is will a peaceful indigenous culture, compared to the bloodthirsty Spaniards and their progeny, be able to assert itself against this assault, which is kind of a racial, imperial, neo-colonial, neoliberal assault. But in this case, They also said they're going to conduct terror attacks on Bolivia's supporters, Venezuela and Cuba, and all the things that they said they're going to do in these tapes: attack the houses of people, attack government buildings, attack consulates of friendly powers, is all happening. So it's remarkable to have such a heinous action occurring right in front of the world's eyes with the entire plot leaked. And it'll be very interesting to see, and I'm sure I'll be not surprised to find out that this audio tape doesn't make it into the New York Times anytime soon. Not until the damage is done. These things will come out, perhaps, but not until the damage is done. And I predict further that so what happened is Morales resigned, then his vice president resigned, and then the leader of the Senate, because their party, the MAS party, has 2/3 of the seat in the Senate and in the House, so to speak, that they have a bicameral legislature there. And so they got the two top MAS people to resign, and then they got the Speaker of the Senate to resign. So finally, the opposition person came in. But I predict there won't be an election with somebody like a Morales leading MAS within 3 to 4 weeks. I predict they know they're too weak, especially with these tapes coming out, and that they are going to use their agent provocateurs to create a propagandist reason not to allow an election. So I'll post the link to these 16 audio tapes, and good night and good luck, and let us oppose this heinous barbarism being conducted on the people of Bolivia, the Aymara people.